Welcome back to my social media Lent devotional series, where together we're following Christ's footsteps to the crucifixion and then beyond to the resurrection. I'm Jennifer Slattery with the Faith Over Fear podcast and also the Your Daily Bible Verse podcast. Have you ever heard anyone talk about how the God of the Old Testament seems really harsh and really angry, and the God of the New Testament seems loving and kind and merciful? Have you maybe felt that way? Honestly, I have. I've read some of the ways that God seemed to respond to people in the Old Testament, to humanity, and I've struggled to reconcile that with what I know to be true about God's grace. And yet, Scripture tells me that God is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. And in the passage we're discussing today, Jesus is speaking to the disciples, and in John 14, verse 7, he said, "If you had known me, you would have known my Father also. From now on, you know him and have seen him." And if you caught today's Your Daily Bible Verse episode, you heard Carol talk about using a humorous story about how the disciples missed what was right in front of them. That the fact that everything Jesus did was a representation of God the Father. So when Jesus displayed love and mercy and grace, it was a reflection of God's heart as well, his love and his mercy and his grace. But they missed it, maybe because it wasn't what they were expecting. And we also know the Pharisees completely missed Jesus, perhaps because they felt a disconnect, maybe when they considered their nation's history, their perception of it, and the God of their history. And when they compared that to what they saw displayed in Jesus, I wonder if they felt a bit of a disconnect. And yet, if we look at what was occurring when God was responding to these people groups in the Old Testament, I think we'll gain a clearer perspective of who he is and what he stands for. And in Jesus Christ, in the cross, we see a perfect blend of the justice of God and the mercy of God. And honestly, we want both, right? We want to know when we've been wronged, when we're suffering, we want to know that there's justice, that there is a God who is one day going to make all things right. And we need his mercy because we know we mess up. I mess up countless times every day, and I'm so grateful for Christ's mercy. And I suggest that we see God's mercy and grace in equal measure displayed in the Old Testament as well. Now, before I launch into a discussion as to why, I do want to give a trigger warning. I'm going to be talking about some things that for some of you might, if you have a history of sexual abuse, physical abuse, child abuse, trauma, this might be difficult for you to hear. So I just want to give you a minute to check off if that is you. So let's look at when we're trying to compare the quote-unquote God of the Old Testament with the quote-unquote God of the New Testament, let's look at some encounters. You might have heard of the worldwide flood. Before the flood, we read in Genesis 6, verse 5, "But the Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind had become great on the earth. Every inclination of the thoughts of their minds was only evil all the time." And then in verse 11, we read, "The earth was ruined in the sight of God. The earth was filled with violence." We've all seen violent nations, wicked nations rise to power, right? I'm thinking of Nazi Germany, or I'm thinking of slavery in the South. Those were horrific, cruel times where people suffered greatly at the hands of violent people. And then we get to Genesis 19, and this is the story, event that occurred in an area known as Sodom and Gomorrah. And to give a little bit of background, there was a man there, his name was Lot. And one day he's sitting outside the city gate, and these two angels come, and he's like, "Hey, come stay at my house." And so he opens his home to them. They come to his home. Once they get there, all of the men in the city, they gather together and they go to Lot's house and they demand, "Hey, give me your visitors that we might have sex with them." So basically that we might gang rape them. Lot responds, "No, instead I've got my daughters and they're virgins. Take them instead." Can you imagine a father? That is the wickedness that had so pervaded this community that it felt completely normal to him or right to him that he would say, "Hey, take my daughters who I'm supposed to be protecting and do with them." He actually said, "Do with them whatever you want." And then we get to the book of Judges, and we learn that the people were engaged in Baal worship, which there were a couple behaviors that were involved in Baal worship and also in the worship of Moloch, which we read occurred later during the time of Kings. And one, this was a fertility god, and so there was a lot of temple prostitution. And one source I read said that in some cultures, women were forced to engage, to give themselves up to temple prostitution at least once in their life before they got married. And so that was going on. And then with Baal, sometimes they also would practice child sacrifice. And they practiced child sacrifice with the god of Moloch as well. And so now just imagine that that's the environment that you lived in. Imagine the generational trauma, the generational abuse, the generational wickedness and violence that would have not only perpetuated, but probably expanded and grown. And so had I been in Sodom and Gomorrah, had I been Lot's daughters, had I been in the time of Judges and maybe one of the women given to temple prostitution, I would want God's justice. I would want a mighty, powerful God to step in and say, this is not okay. You can't do this anymore. And I also want the God who says, the minute you turn to me, wherever you're at, whatever you've done, I will forgive you, I will cleanse you of all unrighteousness, and I will welcome you close. I want a God of justice, and I need a God of mercy. And praise my Father in heaven, through Jesus Christ, we receive both. I don't know which character trait of God you most need this Lenten season. Maybe you have experienced some horrific betrayal, some great injustice, and maybe you need to know that your God is a God of justice, that he sees you, that he sees your pain, that he calls wrong, wrong, and he promises to one day make all things right. And maybe you need his grace. We all need his grace, always. And to remind yourself that when we see Jesus, when we see him upon the cross, saying, Father, forgive them, to praying for his executioners, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. When we see Jesus saying that, we also see God the Father saying that to us. My child, I forgive you because I know you don't know what you do. Or as he prayed in the garden, I know that your spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. And so again, praise Jesus. Wherever we're at today, we belong to a God who is perfect in justice and perfect in grace and mercy.